The Cessna Citation's landing gear thumped down onto runway 27 at Meadowlark Airpark, tires screaming against wet asphalt, and that's when Captain Elena Reyes felt a hand, an actual human hand, close around her wrist on the yoke. "Step away from the controls," said a voice that had no business being in a cockpit. "This aircraft is community property until the lien is settled." Elena didn't turn her head. She couldn't. The runway was still rolling under them at 90 knots, the reverse thrusters were screaming, and the woman standing behind her captain's seat, 61 years old, clipboard in one hand, laminated HOA badge swinging from a lanyard around her neck, was trying to pry her fingers off the throttle like she was repossessing a leased Buick from a used car lot. "Ma'am," Elena said through her teeth, "sit down or we are all going to die. I have every legal right. Sit down." The plane shuddered, fishtailed slightly as the co-pilot fought to keep the nose straight, and somewhere in the back of the cabin, 3 terrified passengers screamed in unison as a 61-year-old woman in a cardigan tried to physically wrestle control of a landing aircraft away from a commercial pilot with 14 years of experience. If you think that sounds insane, wait until you hear how it started. Because 6 months before this moment, this same woman was just an HOA president with a laminating machine and a grudge. And what she turned into by the time she reached that cockpit door was something this quiet little airport community had never seen before, and never wanted to see again. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is the place where we bring you the real stories, the unbelievable, the infuriating, and the deeply satisfying tales of ordinary people who pushed too far, and the karma that eventually caught up with them. Today's story takes us somewhere you don't usually see HOA drama unfold, not a cul-de-sac, not a swimming pool, but an actual airport. A real, working residential airpark, where the driveways are taxiways and the garages are hangars. It's the story of a woman the entire community would come to call Repo Deb, a plot to seize an actual airplane mid-flight, and the arrest that followed once karma finally landed the plane. Stick around, because this one gets wild. Let's rewind to where it all began. Meadowlark Airpark isn't the kind of place most people even know exists. Tucked into the hills about 40 minutes outside the city, it's what aviation folks call a fly-in community, a residential neighborhood built directly around a private runway, where every home has direct taxiway access to a 4,200-foot strip of asphalt. Instead of 2-car garages, most houses have hangars. Instead of morning traffic, residents listen to the low hum of propellers warming up before sunrise. Elena Reyes had lived there for 6 years. She flew charter jets for a private aviation company, ferrying executives and families up and down the coast, and when she wasn't in the air, she was usually elbow-deep in the guts of her own restoration project, a 1975 Beechcraft Bonanza she'd bought as a wreck and was slowly, lovingly rebuilding in her hangar on weekends. Meadowlark was small. 42 homes, 1 shared runway, 1 clubhouse that doubled as a pilot's lounge, and a close-knit community of retired airline captains, weekend hobbyists, a crop duster named Hank who'd been flying since Vietnam, and a hangar full of kids who'd grown up thinking a driveway with a plane parked in it was just what driveways looked like. It was, by every account, a peaceful place. Neighbors helped tow each other's aircraft. Someone always had spare avgas if you ran short. On Sunday evenings, half the community gathered on the tarmac in front of the clubhouse with lawn chairs and grilled burgers while the sun went down behind the runway lights. Elena loved it there. It was quiet. It was hers. That peace lasted right up until the Homeowners Association elected a new president. Her name was Deborah Vance, and she moved into Meadowlark 8 months before the story really begins, buying the biggest house on the property, a sprawling place at the end of the runway with a hangar large enough to fit 2 aircraft, even though Deborah didn't own so much as a kite. She didn't fly. She'd never flown. As far as anyone could tell, she'd bought into the airpark because the real estate listing described it as exclusive and gated, and Deborah Vance loved nothing in this world more than the word exclusive. Within 3 months, she'd run for HOA president unopposed, mostly because nobody else wanted the job, and within 4, she had rewritten the community bylaws twice, instituted a mandatory quarterly hangar inspection, and started sending residents citations for infractions nobody had ever heard of before, including unauthorized aircraft nose direction and excessive propeller shine causing glare non-compliant with dusk aesthetic standards. She wore a laminated badge that said HOA President even to the mailbox. She carried a clipboard everywhere, including, residents swore, to the community pool. And she had a favorite phrase, one she used so often that half the neighborhood could do the impression by heart. I don't make the rules. I just enforce them. Which was, of course, a lie, because Deborah Vance made up most of the rules herself, on the spot, whenever it suited her. For the first few months, Elena mostly avoided her. She paid her dues on time, kept her hangar tidy, and figured if she stayed out of Deborah's way, Deborah would stay out of hers. She figured wrong. It started, as these things usually do, over something small. Elena had painted a set of house numbers on her hangar door, simple black stencil numbers, the same style every other hangar in Meadowlark used, matching the community's own guidelines to the letter. 2 days later, a citation appeared taped to her front door. Violation, unauthorized signage. Fine, $150. Compliance required within 72 hours. Elena laughed at first, assuming it was a mistake. She brought the citation to the clubhouse, where Deborah was holding what she called office hours, at a folding table with a laptop and a stack of pre-printed fine forms. These are the exact numbers everyone else uses, Elena said, showing a photo of 3 neighboring hangars with identical stenciling. Those were grandfathered in before I updated the aesthetic code, Deborah said without looking up. Yours is new. New signage needs board approval. I didn't put up new signage. I repainted numbers that were already there. Repainting counts as new installation under Section 14, subsection C. You wrote Section 14 last month. Deborah finally looked up, and smiled the kind of smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. Then I suppose you'll want to read it more carefully going forward, won't you? Elena paid the fine. It felt easier than fighting it. But that was the moment, as she'd later tell the group chat of fellow residents that was quietly starting to form, that she realized Deborah Vance wasn't interested in rules at all. She was interested in power. And an airport, it turned out, was an incredible place for someone like that to find it, because airplanes come with logbooks, maintenance records, fuel receipts, insurance paperwork, mountains of documentation that a person with a clipboard and a mean streak could weaponize if she really wanted to. And Deborah really wanted to. It began with small things. Elena's hangar padlock, which she always left on a specific hook by the door, kept turning up on the floor. A 5-gallon can of aviation oil disappeared from her workbench. Then, more troubling, a set of cotter pins and safety wires she'd laid out for a control surface inspection vanished overnight, sending her scrambling to source replacements before her scheduled charter flight the next morning. Other residents started reporting strange things too. Hank, the old crop duster, found his tie-down ropes cut clean through one morning, his plane rocking loose in the wind. A young family 2 hangars down had their child's bicycle, parked, as always, just inside the open hangar door, go missing entirely, only to reappear a week later, confiscated, with a note reading, "Bicycles are not permitted within 20 feet of taxiway per updated code." Nothing was ever damaged badly enough to report to police. Nothing was ever stolen in a way that felt criminal, exactly, just relocated, withheld, confiscated for compliance review, always with Deborah's fingerprints somewhere nearby, and never any proof. But Elena's gut told her something worse was coming. Because 2 weeks before the incident that would make her famous on the internet, she noticed something that chilled her far more than a missing padlock ever could. Her aircraft logbook, the FAA-required maintenance record for her Bonanza, the document that legally had to travel with the plane and proved every repair, every inspection, every hour flown, was gone from the lockbox in her hangar. In its place was a photocopied HOA memo that read: "Records pertaining to community-adjacent aircraft may be reviewed by the board at any time to ensure compliance with airpark standards. D. Vance, President. Elena stood in her hangar holding that memo for a long time. Because an HOA has no legal authority whatsoever over federally mandated aircraft documentation. None. Zero. And yet here was proof that Deborah Vance had let herself into a private hangar and taken it anyway. That was the night Elena decided she needed more than a group chat. She needed evidence. Elena wasn't the type to escalate things loudly. 14 years of flying had taught her that the best pilots don't panic, they diagnose, they plan, and they execute. So she started quietly diagnosing. First, she installed a set of weatherproof trail cameras, the kind hunters use to track deer movement, angled to cover her hangar door, her workbench, and the lockbox where her logbook had disappeared from. She mounted a second, smaller camera disguised inside an old aviation radio housing, aimed at the shared taxiway between her hangar and Deborah's. Then she reached out, carefully, to the other residents who'd reported strange disappearances. It turned out almost everyone had a story. Hank's cut tie-down ropes. The missing bicycle. A retired airline captain named Winston who'd had an entire toolbox go missing, only for its contents to mysteriously turn up itemized on an HOA surplus equipment spreadsheet Deborah had once accidentally left open on the clubhouse printer. Together, they formed something that was half neighborhood watch, half sting operation. They set what Hank affectionately called the trap, deliberately leaving a clearly labeled, clearly non-compliant item sitting just outside Elena's hangar door one evening, an old wooden propeller, painted bright red, with a hand-lettered sign taped to it reading, in an obvious bait, property of E. Reyes, do not remove. Then they waited. At 11:47 that night, the trail camera caught it. Deborah Vance, in a bathrobe and slippers, walking down the taxiway with a wheeled dolly. She stopped at Elena's hangar, read the sign out loud to herself, the camera's audio picked up her muttering, "Oh, we'll see about that," and loaded the propeller onto the dolly anyway. Then she wheeled it directly into her own hangar and shut the door. Elena watched the footage 4 times before she believed it. Then she called Hank. Then she called Winston. Then, together, they made copies. The community had a monthly HOA meeting scheduled for the following Thursday, held, as always, in the clubhouse with folding chairs arranged in rows facing a small podium where Deborah liked to stand with her clipboard, reading off violations to a room of increasingly weary homeowners. This time, Elena signed up for the open comment period. When her turn came, she walked up to the podium, connected her laptop to the clubhouse projector, and said, simply, "Before we get into new business, I'd like to share some footage I think everyone should see." Deborah, seated in the front row, straightened in her chair. "This isn't on the agenda." "It is now," Elena said, and pressed play. The room watched, in total silence, as their HOA president crept down a taxiway in her bathrobe at midnight and stole a hand-labeled propeller off a neighbor's property. Then Elena played a second clip, security footage from the clubhouse's own hallway camera, time-stamped 3 weeks earlier, showing Deborah letting herself into the records office after hours with a spare key she was never issued, flipping through what could clearly be identified, frame by frame, as Elena's missing logbook. The silence broke into a low, disbelieving murmur, and then, from somewhere in the back row, Hank's voice cut through it, flat and dry as the desert. "Well, I'll be damned. Repo Deb." The nickname stuck instantly. Someone laughed. Someone else didn't. Winston stood up, red-faced, and asked pointedly whether his missing toolbox was going to turn up on that surplus equipment spreadsheet he'd definitely seen once. A young mother 2 rows back asked, voice shaking with anger, why her son's bicycle had been confiscated by someone with zero legal jurisdiction to confiscate anything. Deborah stood up, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "This footage is being taken wildly out of context. There's no context that explains stealing a logbook," Elena said. "That's a federal document. It has to travel with the aircraft. You had no right to touch it, let alone remove it. I have every right as president of this association to ensure compliance. You have the right to fine me $50 for an ugly mailbox," Elena said. You do not have the right to break into a hangar and steal federally required paperwork. That's not an HOA violation, Deborah. That's theft. The room broke into applause, real, sustained applause, the kind that happens when a community that's been quietly suffering finally watches someone say out loud what everyone had been thinking. Deborah's face went a shade of red that clashed badly with her cardigan, and she stormed out of the meeting without another word, clipboard clutched to her chest like the last life raft off a sinking ship. Elena thought that was the end of it. She had absolutely no idea it was only the beginning. Deborah Vance did not take public humiliation well. Over the following 2 weeks, the HOA board, minus Deborah, who'd been quietly stripped of most of her authority by an emergency vote, began the process of removing her from the presidency entirely. Formal complaints were filed. A community attorney got involved. There was even talk of pressing actual theft charges over the logbook, though Elena, ever the pragmatist, mostly just wanted her documents back and her hangar left alone. But Deborah wasn't finished. If anything, being caught seemed to unlock something worse in her, a conviction that she was owed something, that this airpark and everyone in it belonged to her in some deeper, unfalsifiable way that mere bylaws could never fully capture. She started showing up at odd hours, walking the runway perimeter with her clipboard like she still had authority there. She sent Elena a string of increasingly unhinged emails, citing bylaws that didn't exist, threatening liens on Elena's hangar, and, in the message that finally made Elena screenshot everything and forward it to a lawyer, claiming that because Elena's bonanza had once, years earlier, been partially financed through a since-dissolved community equipment co-op that predated Deborah's presidency by nearly a decade, the aircraft was, quote, subject to HOA reclamation pending full audit of community assets. It was, in every legal sense, complete nonsense. The co-op had been dissolved for 8 years. Elena had paid off every cent of that plane herself, in full, with documentation to prove it. But Deborah had convinced herself of an alternate reality where she was the rightful custodian of a community's worth of property, airplanes included, and she was not going to let something as small as reality stand in her way. Which brings us back to the day none of Meadowlark will ever forget. Elena had a scheduled charter that morning, a short hop, ferrying a family of 4 back to Meadowlark after a weekend trip, landing on the community's own runway around noon. It should have been routine. It was the kind of flight she'd done hundreds of times. What she didn't know was that Deborah had spent the morning at the clubhouse, working herself into a state, convinced that this particular flight, landing back at Meadowlark, on her runway, in her jurisdiction, was her last chance to assert what she now genuinely believed was her authority over the aircraft before the board's removal vote finalized that evening. She was waiting in the clubhouse parking area when Elena's citation came in on final approach, and rather than staying where she belonged, Deborah marched out onto the tarmac itself, a serious safety violation on its own, flagging down a lineman with a golf cart and talking her way onto the ramp under the pretense of an emergency HOA inspection. By the time Elena's aircraft touched down and was still rolling out on landing rollout, Deborah had gotten the golf cart alongside the taxiing plane, banged on the cabin door hard enough that the co-pilot, thinking there was some kind of ground emergency, popped the door to check, and Deborah shoved past both him and a startled flight attendant, marched straight up the aisle, and threw open the cockpit door while the aircraft was still moving at nearly 90 knots. "This aircraft is community property until the lien is settled," she announced, exactly as she'd apparently rehearsed, and grabbed for the yoke. This is the moment you heard about at the very start of this story, Elena's wrist in Deborah's grip, the plane still rolling, passengers screaming, a woman in a cardigan trying to physically wrestle control of 90 knots of aircraft away from a licensed commercial pilot because she'd convinced herself an HOA badge outranked a pilot's license. Elena did not let go of the controls. She couldn't have, even if she'd wanted to. Every instinct 14 years of training had built into her took over, and she wrenched her arm free, shoved Deborah bodily backward with her free hand, and rode the aircraft down through reverse thrust and braking with the flight deck door hanging open and a 61-year-old woman sprawled against the avionics bay, screaming that this was unlawful obstruction of a homeowner's rights. The citation rolled to a stop just past the taxiway turnoff. Elena set the parking brake, killed the engines, and turned around in her seat for the first time since the whole thing began. "Get off my aircraft," she said, in a voice so calm it was almost more frightening than if she'd screamed. Airport security had already been called the moment ground control heard the commotion over the radio. Elena's co-pilot had keyed the mic mid-struggle, and the tower had heard every second of it. By the time Deborah stumbled out onto the tarmac, straightening her cardigan and still insisting she'd only been performing a lawful inspection, 2 airport police vehicles were already rolling across the ramp, lights flashing. What Deborah Vance did not seem to understand, what, in fact, almost none of the residents watching from the clubhouse windows quite believed until they heard the actual charges read aloud, was that interfering with a flight crew during operation of an aircraft isn't an HOA matter at all. It's a federal crime. Under U.S. federal law, interference with a flight crew performing their duties, especially during a critical phase of flight like landing rollout, carries the possibility of serious felony charges, and airport police do not care one bit whether the person doing the interfering owns a laminated badge that says President on it. Deborah was placed in handcuffs on the tarmac in full view of the family she'd terrified, the ground crew, a knot of stunned airpark residents who'd wandered out from the clubhouse at the sound of sirens, and, because someone always has their phone out these days, at least 4 different camera angles that would end up online by that evening. She protested the entire walk to the patrol car. "I am the HOA president. Do you understand what authority that carries? Do you have any idea who I am?" The responding officer, a man who had clearly had a very long career and had seen a great many things, paused with one hand on top of the patrol car door and said, without a trace of irony, "Ma'am, out here, that badge means about as much as a library card." Hank, watching from a safe distance with a lawn chair he'd apparently brought specifically for the occasion, was heard to remark to no one in particular, "Well, I suppose that's what you call a hard landing." The video of Deborah Vance being led away in handcuffs, cardigan askew, still shouting about her jurisdiction, made its way around the small aviation community within hours and around a much larger corner of the internet within days. Local news picked it up under a headline that made Hank laugh so hard he had to sit down, "HOA president arrested after attempting to seize cockpit controls mid-landing." Deborah was charged with interference with a flight crew, unlawful entry to a secured aircraft ramp area, and, once the earlier footage came out during the investigation, a separate charge related to the theft of Elena's logbook and other residents' property. The HOA board didn't wait for a courtroom to finish the job they'd started weeks earlier. She was formally removed as president that same evening, in absentia, in a vote that one board member described as the fastest unanimous decision in the history of this association. In the weeks that followed, Meadowlark quietly rebuilt itself. Fines that had never made sense were reversed. Hank got a formal, if grudging, apology and a new set of tie-down ropes courtesy of the HOA's emergency fund. The young family got their son's bicycle back, along with, at Winston's very vocal insistence, a public accounting of every single item that had ever appeared on that mysterious surplus equipment spreadsheet. Elena got her logbook back, water-stained but intact, recovered from a filing cabinet in Deborah's hangar during the police search, right next to, residents later learned with equal parts horror and hilarity, a laminated folder containing hand-drawn diagrams of community aircraft reclamation procedures that Deborah had apparently been quietly developing for months. The Sunday evening cookouts on the tarmac came back, and if anything, they got a little bigger, a little louder, a little more full of neighbors who'd never really talked much before but now had one very specific, very unifying story to bond over. Here's the thing about power, especially the small, homemade kind, the kind that comes from a laminated badge and a folding table rather than any real authority. It tends to convince the person holding it that the badge is the source of the power, rather than the community that agreed to tolerate it in the first place. Deborah Vance never had authority over Elena's airplane. She never had authority over a logbook, or a bicycle, or a set of tie-down ropes, or, certainly, over the controls of a moving aircraft on final rollout. What she had was a title that a tired, distracted community handed her because nobody else wanted the paperwork, and she mistook that convenience for a kingdom. The real lesson isn't really about HOAs, or airplanes, or even about Deborah specifically. It's about what happens when small authority goes unchecked for too long, and what it takes to check it, a few neighbors who stopped assuming someone else would deal with it, a handful of trail cameras, and one pilot who refused to let go of the controls, literally and otherwise, when it mattered most. Communities, like aircraft, need someone willing to hold the yoke steady when things get rough. They just need to make sure it's the right person holding it. So that's the story of Repo Deb, the HOA president who tried to seize a moving aircraft mid-landing and ended up in handcuffs on her own runway instead. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with an HOA president who took their little bit of power way too far? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and honestly, some of the stories you all send in are even wilder than this one. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and I'll see you in the next one.